This is Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair. Resilience is all about making a choice when the unexpected hits you so that you can move forward. And this show is all about opening possibilities for you so that when that does happen, you can move on. Today, we're introducing live streaming on my YouTube channel, Madelyn Blair. And if you just heard an echo recently, that's because it's on the machine that we're using here to monitor that. So these things I have to tell you, this is the first time we're doing it. And so we're going to stumble. But that's how it is when you try something new. So I hope you'll be kind as I stumble. I think if it works out well, though, you should be able to ask me questions, make comments actually during the show. And we're going to be monitoring that so that we can bring those questions to our guests today. So I'm going to do my best to watch them as well as my guest. So I'll know when something there is there to report. Now, on today's show of Unlocked, we'll be exploring the hows and whys of international assignments. Now, if you think that you're not working internationally or in international settings, think again. We always think, well, if I don't work for Apple, I don't work for Amazon, I don't work for whatever, any company that you know is big. It turns out, however, that the majority of small businesses have international customers or clients. So it's pretty widespread, and it really helps to be able to have that exposure. But let me tell you about an example from my own life. When I was asked to give a speech in Sao Paulo, Brazil, I was excited. It was my first time going to South America. Besides, Sao Paulo is a great city. And the topic I was to speak on was one of my favorites, storytelling. Now, I realized that I knew absolutely no Portuguese. So I fell back on my usual strategy of taking the little time that I had to learn the basics of like, please, excuse me, thank you. Now, my talk was called Stories Inside of Words. It's actually one of my favorites, and I've given it many times because audiences always love it. Part of its attraction is that I open and close with poetry, because the poetry kind of ties the message together perfectly. My talk would be, of course, in English, and the audience would have the option of headphones through which the interpreter would translate my words. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with the term interpreter, it means the work done by those who translate at the time. In other words, what we would call live. They are impressive individuals who must be ready to interpret quickly so that they are never very far behind the actual words spoken. In fact, the really great ones actually bring the intonation of the speaker into their interpretation as they speak to the other party. It is such hard work that often they are scheduled to be relieved every 20 minutes. Can you imagine? Well, as I mentioned in my talks, I often use poetry. So now with poetry, the interpreter is at a distinct disadvantage. Translating word for word does not convey the same meaning as the original. And having worked with interpreters at the World Bank when I was there, I knew to send the poetry ahead of time so that the interpreter would have time to prepare his translation that would also convey the deeper meaning of the poetry, along with the loveliness of a poem. Before the event, I will tell you that the interpreter thanked me profusely for that courtesy. Now, as I gave my talk, The audience was clearly appreciative of my content, nodding, joining in. When I asked them to do an exercise, with the person next to them, I even had them call out insights that they gained, and which they did. Yes, I had earphones on too, so that I could have the interpretation to English when they were doing it in Portuguese. But I will tell you what really stood out for me was when at the very end of my talk, when I knew that the interpretation was complete, I wanted to thank the audiences. In my very best Portuguese, I said, obrigada. Well, when they heard my small attempt to meet them in their own language, they were thrilled. I mean, there were cheers, there was applaud, hooting. Now, I know the audience got a great deal from the content of my talk, but I sometimes think that their applause was more for that small attempt to meet them where they were. I've worked in many countries, but not nearly as many as my guest today, Paul Corney. Let me bring him on screen so you can see him. There he is. There he is. Paul has worked in over 23 countries as a management consultant that specializes in the challenges of management of information and knowledge. He most often works at the highest levels of the organizations and companies that engage him. He has taken great care in thinking through what it takes to work effectively across different languages, different cultures, different procedures, different laws, and more. I really can't wait to hear about his insights about what it means to engage in an international assignment. In one of his papers on the topic, he says, in today's global village, the ability to work cross-border and cross-culture is increasingly important. And then he goes on to write about what it means to deal with the entire life cycle of an international assignment, from negotiating to getting paid. Paul Corney, welcome to Unlocked. I'm so looking forward to hearing all about the hows and whys of running successful international assignments.
Madelyn, that's a very generous opening and a very generous welcome, and I'm delighted to be here. I was just, when you were talking, I was trying to think, we used to spend time in Washington together, didn't we, at
Yes.
The storytelling, the Golden Fleece.
Yes.
And it took me back listening to you talking about stories and the value of those. I too you made me think as well. I should share a story of my first ever visit to Colombia, and I was giving the keynote speech at a big event, and it was an honor and a privilege to be there. It was in May, I remember, and it was quite fascinating because. Again, all the things you were talking about with interpreters came to mind. The value of, I'd learned in Moscow many years before when I'd seen somebody had a very unfortunate experience because the interpreter had not spent time with the person. I mean, one of the first things, and it's a tip I think I share later on, one of the first things I always remember was spend time a day before with the interpreter and going through what you're going to say, because you are a team. They used to tell me, interpreters who work for the G7, it was the worst possible thing when they turn up and a politician just talks off the cuff and they have to follow. Anyway, so I'd spent time with them, and it was lovely. My slides had gone in advance, and the night before they sent me my slides, but they sent me my slides in Spanish. Now, my Portuguese, and I'm lucky I'm also a resident of Portugal. My Portuguese is probably better than my Spanish, but that says very little. So the thought of spending a 25-minute presentation trying to talk in Spanish would have been a problem. So I dug my toes in and spent a lot of time with the interpreter. The other comment I'd make is sometimes thinking about impact of how you're presenting yourself. And especially if you want to convey a message in an international environment, you want to stand out, make sure you're very different than the person and the way some of the other people dress. Be courteous, but don't necessarily conform, because if you're conforming, people won't necessarily listen to you.
Oh, now that's an interesting comment. And that is probably relates in almost any setting, international or not.
Mm, massively. But it's accentuated because if English is a second language to people,
Mhm.
then they tend to focus on you.
Mhm.
And I remember once in New York speaking far too quickly and everybody thinking I was Australian and having a real challenge with the audience because I kept thinking, slow down. And one of the other phrases that one of my coaches gave me in my early days in investment banking was, did you get that pause? Which is especially important when dealing in international environments, is to let the thought sink. So the ability to look at different parts of the room and hold the silence, to let the silence, to let people's thoughts catch up.
Oh, I love that comment because that's also, I've written about that. The fact that our brains really need time to integrate what we're hearing.
Mm.
And if you if you rattle on, whether it's in the same language or not, you still need to have that.
That comes through in so many ways, and we can go whichever direction you want to with this conversation. I remember one of my pieces of work in the last decade was helping a new business come together. And you can say it's an international assignment in some ways because the people on the it was a really interesting new business. It was about storing energy in a vacuum, and it was so, and how relevant it is today. But we're talking about 5-6 years ago, and the organisation was just coming together, and I was helping coach the management team, and it was your Brazilian comment that reminded me. The head of the business was Greek. His partner, wife, was Brazilian, and the management team comprised somebody from Eritrea, somebody from Italy, a German, a Kurd, and I can't remember the other nationality, but there was a Welshman for whom English was a second language. And it was really interesting at the beginning because we had challenges on when people don't like to think they haven't understood or to be seen as though they haven't understood. And one of the challenges that we came across was this: yes, yes. People acknowledge, to your point, where they haven't absorbed. So we came up with a mantra which everybody ran for the first 6 months of the business, which was, I heard you to say, and I understood you to mean.
Oh, excellent. I'm going to write that down.
And I think I've written about it, so you could type that into my blog site and read about it. But it was a very interesting way, and I do this even in businesses I work with now, exactly the same thing, because people you're legitimizing somebody saying, actually, excuse me, can I just go back over what you said? Mm-hmm. So we often, for the first 6 months of any business like that, say, I heard you to say and I understood you to mean. And when working internationally across different boundaries, that's massive.
Yep. Well, we promised to give Hows and Whys. We've already done some, but let's bring to our audience some of the thoughts that actually you have summarized in a document, which I'm delighted to say to our viewers that this is available to you. I'll tell you a little bit later how you can get it. But Paul, I wonder if you would just begin by talking about some of the general things, and I think you already have begun doing that one has to do to just sort of get ready. I mean, this aspect of knowing that people who have another language as their first language may interpret you differently. And so you have to give them time to think about it. What are some other things?
Well, let me start. Perhaps if I go through something that isn't in the papers, if I think about it in a fairly logical way, how about if we start with maybe winning the business?
Okay.
Because winning the business is often a critical thing, and and I think you have to ask yourself some fundamental questions. And I guess that aspect of it, winning the business, is very much about asking yourself, having a few criteria, and it doesn't matter whether you're dealing locally in your own country or you're dealing overseas with people. I guess the first question I always ask is, are they for real? How often do you get a situation where you're being put forward as tender fodder? Now, what I mean by that is, and I learned that very much, is from my banking days, where if you're dealing with organized governments and public bodies and others, they very often need 3 quotes. Are you one of the 3 quotes? Is this coming as a recommendation from somebody? Are they serious? Is it going to matter to the organization? And some of the criteria that I apply when I decide whether I'm going to even sort of discuss it is it something? Is it going to be profitable? Am I going to learn something? One of the things that I've discovered, I'm not as young as I was, and it's more about time rather than money. Yeah. Is this something I want to do? And is the organization actually going to do something with it? Very often, and it's more prevalent, I fear, when you're dealing internationally, because and this is an awfully generalistic comment, and probably one I shouldn't make, but what tends to happen is things used to filter from the West across, and some of the ideas that came forward, people felt they had to copy. Now, that's not right, but that's what often happens. So, was it a tick in the box, or was it something that's actually going to change the organization? Will it make a difference? And I guess will it enhance what you've done? Does doing it make a difference to you? And will it be challenging? And will it? You think at the end of it, are we going to make the people on the other side better people for having done it? So they're little nuggets that I think apply whether you're in the UK, in the USA, in Europe, in Africa. It doesn't matter where you are. So I'll give you a chance for that to sink and think about that. The next aspect that probably I'd talk about is the idea of actually negotiating it. And this is where very often the language aspect really does come into play, because one of the challenges is, what do it goes back to, I heard you to say and I understand you to mean. What do they actually mean by this piece of work? Is there a translation from the word? It might be a specific term in your language into another language. Things like that are actually quite important. So how do you get a mutually agreeable scope that reflects the effort that you're going to put in? And I think one of the things that always comes over for me is, especially if you're dealing internationally with big corporations and you're a small and medium-sized enterprise, their cash payment terms are very often 90 days plus. Mm-hmm. And if you think about that, for a small business, cash flow is king. There aren't that many small businesses today, especially post-pandemic, that have more than 3-month cash flow. So if you're waiting for cash flow from a large multinational corporation somewhere else, then you could be in trouble. I mean, one of the businesses I was in, I won't name the business, but there was a Dutch company at the time, very well-respected Dutch company, who said the terms were 120 days.
Wow.
And we said no. Because it doesn't matter how much we're going to be paying our associates or whatever, and it would have been a nightmare. So you have to, and one of the ways that potentially you do that is by insisting on some kind of upfront mobilization fee. And I think it comes back to having the nous and the ability to say, no, I'm walking away from this if they don't do it. Because otherwise there is nothing worse than being in a hole and having to finance receivables.
So true. And that happens certainly even within your own country. But I agree with you. It is more um, important international because you.
The other thing I think is what triggers payments. And I was working with a friend of mine in from Tanzania, and he was doing an assignment for a very large multilateral organization based in Africa, and his he did everything. He did it all right, and I helped him produce some of his reports and his feedback. And he made a great mistake, which I wished I'd have seen the contract before he signed it and started doing it, because payment was triggered by sign off of his reports, but he didn't specify who was going to be signing it off.
Oh my!
9 months later, he was still waiting to be paid.
Wow!
Because he was caught up in a political battle between the person who contracted the work and somebody else in the organization. And very often you're in the middle of that. So I think it's very, very important to have a good understanding of what the payment terms are and what the trigger payments are. We all love to say that we work for Asian Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, all these big World Bank, your old hunting ground, all these big institutions. But actually, if they're going to send you out of business, don't do it. And do remember, and I might be talking to people who aren't small, medium enterprises, but if you are, just remember your cash flow.
Yeah. Always cash flow is king. I agree with you. Yeah. I'll never forget someone asked me one time when I had first started my business, 30 some years ago, how did I manage my marketing? And I said, you don't manage marketing, you manage cash.
Yeah, I mean, it's of all the businesses I've helped grow in the last 25 years, many of them, we've always had that thing that don't live beyond your means. I was privileged to be very heavily involved with the dot-com business back in the 1998. I sat on the board. I was their strategic advisor, and we bought companies. We merged a company in Holland with a company in the UK. We then bought a company in Minneapolis, expanded into Denver, bought a company in Frankfurt, and I was pulling together a lot of those businesses. But I always remember the time, one of the biggest things that we had, to emphasize your point about cash flow, was intercompany travel was always coach, right? And you only ever flew club if you were flying to more than so many hours to a client.
Yeah.
And that company's still around today and thriving. And many of the others at the time went to the wall.
It's a great story, great example.
My third example, because it picks onto that, is around sort of traveling and staying. And that's when I was a banker, and latterly even when I was consulting, running consulting businesses, one of the things I found was I was doing about at least 50 flights a year. And I got to know a lot about airline schedules and the sort of things, the safety things, and who you would fly with. Because for me, it was about how they treated you when you couldn't get off the runway because of restrictions at Zurich Airport. So they had to put you up overnight, or you landed in, as we did one day. A very good friend of ours, jointly, Victoria Ward, we were going to an assignment in Manila, and Typhoon Onday hit, so we were transshipping via Hong Kong and never actually got there. And it was about, could you go and stay somewhere and then get on down as quickly as you could. So it matters who you fly with for that reason, and where you sit. I joked with you before we started. I've written about being in 47K, which is the best seat on Emirates, because it's 47A or 47K because it's downstairs. It's got the most leg room, in the economy seat, but also if you get a 777, it's where the threes become two, so you get more. So you just say you want 47k in those days when you could choose seats. And the other thing that I always used to do was use seatguru.com because it would tell you which were the best seats on which plane. And
Wow.
you know, and why am I saying that? Because actually, you know what? Again, if you're managing an international assignment, that matters, because very often you'll get the budget for your travel. You don't want to spend it all flying club or first. You know, if you can pay your people more because you've flown premium economy and the best seat, you know, because all you're doing is sleeping very often or watching a movie.
Interesting.
Yeah. So they're little things that I find is really really important and really relevant. Another comment which I probably make, if this does this work for you, by the way?
It's working, except that I would like us also to be talking about the interaction that occurs between us or you and your international person that you're working with, because I think, yes, all this travel and the business, the management of business is critical, but in the end, you have to work with people. So I wonder if you could share.
Guess what my next heading is? Working and communicating.
Good. See, great minds. What can
exactly.
I
say? And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about that, and that's something that I have written about in the post I'm going to put up there in a minute, is about this sort of linguistic and cultural emphasis. You know, you if you go into a different organization, there's things you need to look for. And there's a book in particular that I recommend highly, and that's Erin Meyer's The Culture Map, which Erin was actually, it's fascinating. She was I came across this by a lady called Gillian Tett, who's the FT's based in New York, one of the FT writers, excellent writer, and she wrote about the culture map. And at the time, I think I was partly I'd helped set a charity up in the UK, and we had a really interesting situation where we had a Portuguese chief executive and a chairperson who was a very old English general. And so the communication and miscommunication came straight back to my days of working with the Dutch and the Germans and the Americans and the British. And the culture map picked up a lot of those ambiguities. And there's another book called Mind the Linguistic Gap, the Anglo-Dutch Translation Guide, which again is really interesting. So as an example, and I found this working in Holland a lot, when we would say, I think you need to work on that idea, right? The British would mean, don't come back to me with that, it's ridiculous. And the Dutch and others would take their way, well, they quite like that. and this comes out, and this came out in a big piece of work that we did when I was with Victoria at Spark many years ago, for one of the divisions of a very famous UK bank, who were the banker of the Queen, and they had a set of 16 operations around the world, and their back offices were struggling to come together. And one of the way, and part of the problem was they had no common point of reference. So, and I'll just read from you about email. Email, when people write things down, it's even worse than when they speak. So here's an example of what was happening. It said, somebody came up to me with an email. Look at that, I've got a compliment. And I told him, have you read it thoroughly? And he said, you should read it again, because this is just saying you're a bit stupid, and that's not at all a compliment. So what the person has actually said, people need to be careful in reading emails sometimes and not jump to conclusions that might be misleading. So what would happen is people would misinterpret that. And because we didn't have the ability, there were no ways of breaking down barriers. And one of the techniques that we deployed was getting people to talk about a day in the life, and to actually follow someone's road to the office. so that we got to understand what somebody did. The other thing which worked incredibly well in terms of communicating and breaking barriers, which was the idea of virtual cake. So we would ask, we'd have regular meetings, and we'd encourage people from one domicile, say the Netherlands in this case, to talk about Vlaai, which is a Dutch cake made in the south of Holland. And everybody would have that cake in all the other parts of the business. So we'd make sure that each time we got the cake or the particular food to the other offices. So it meant there was a way of communicating. You broke down barriers, so you improved those communications.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you, Paul, because we need to take a quick commercial break. And when we come back, I want to share a story in relationship to that occurs right within people who are all the same culture.
Okay.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair, and today we're talking with Paul Corney. Paul is talking about the hows and whys of international assignments. And it's been a very interesting talk. And I promised before the commercial that I would share with you about how we can help communication, even when people understand, well, they think they understand perfectly the same language and the same culture even. I began this talk, this session today, by talking about speaking in Sao Paulo. Now, that was a different situation, but I gave that same talk at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Institute. And it was to principally Americans in the audience. And we were talking about the word freedom. And the session that I did was called Stories Inside Words. And I asked people to simply tell a story to the person next to them, inspired by the word freedom. Well, you wouldn't believe how different people interpret that word, which we bandy about in this country all the time. It was a real eye-opener for people. And I've used that often when I'm working with a group that thinks they have a mission statement, and they discover that when they talk about quality, they're talking about different things. When they're talking about standards, they're talking about different things. But those stories illuminate that difference. So, Paul, that's one of the tricks I have used.
Let me play on that, because we deployed somebody, you know, Carol Russell, and I worked in Manila, and we looked at the mission statement of the Asian Development Bank, and we had a group of about 80 people in their atrium at the start of how do you use narrative in an organization, and we chose and we've called this, and I think you've done the same, story in a word.
That's my thing.
Yeah, and we've talked specifically about how to use a phrase, tell a story of what that means to you, a word or phrase from the mission statement, and then play that back. And I can remember to this day people crying in the audience because it brought out in a very powerful way what it meant. Now, the relevance in a lot of organizations is that they tend to cascade stories down the organization. But the point is that organizational change doesn't take place until people own their own version of the story.
Mm-hmm. So true.
You can have a high level corporate mission and corporate vision or whatever. And I'll tell you something close at home. When I took over running a golf club in England, I was executive chairman for 3 years of a golf club. And one of the challenges was to get people to understand, okay, what was our mission? You know, and then to cascade down from that in a way that everybody could tell a story about. And so we wanted stories that exemplified the value of that organization, what it meant to other people. And we had a wonderful story. I won't take too long on this, but we had a wonderful story of a problem that occurred when we had a new catering manager, and we weren't catering for people when they arrived. And our Brazilian greenkeeper, believe it or not, Brazil keeps coming up. Our Brazilian greenkeeper worked with a Portuguese chef, and they actually cooked the food and took it out on little golf buggies, so that some of the people who didn't have their bacon rolls had it. And we had a picture drawn up of that. And it was our story that everybody picked up in the golf club. And everybody would say that's what you can screw up. But once you screw up, it's how you put it right that matters. So for me, that's partly the working and communicating thing. The other thing I would also say is if you're doing any assignment, albeit international or domestic, make sure that you have, I call it sort of have your listening group. Have people who you've got a group that you're working with. Go and see how people communicate. Go to the water cooler. Go and listen. You know, the first couple of I talk about listening ears and noticing eyes. You know, don't say much when you first go in, and make sure in no matter which country you're in that you've really thought about how that's going to work. You know, what do you hear? We used to write back on some of our early assignments. We used to write back when I think it was when Yammer when it's in its infancy. We type our notes at the end of the day of what we'd seen and heard. And there is a very good technique that we used in Darfur, actually, when we were on assignment in Darfur. And at the end, and it was at the time when there was a lot of conflict going on. And at the end of the day, we would sit down, each of us, and for 5 minutes, we'd talk about what we'd seen and observed. And then the other people would play back what they'd heard us to say. Put it out there. So there are different techniques that you can use to communicate. The final thing I think I'd say on that is, especially if you're working in different countries, the style is different. So I used to always, certainly in the Middle East, I'd always have a 15-minute call, 15-minute conversation at the beginning of the day with our sponsor or whoever our point person was, discussing what had gone on the previous day and were there any things that came up that we needed to deal with. So it was always built into the schedule. Anyway, there are just a few thoughts about the working style, which I think are important.
I want to go back to your listening ears. I've done a lot of work, as you know, in international arenas, not just the World Bank, but also the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. And in order to assure that I was connecting with them, I would always ask a question around to have them describe to me what they meant when they said someone had treated them with respect. Because in international arenas, respect is so important. Well, everywhere respect is important. And the amazing thing to me is it didn't matter what culture I was in, what country I was in, what age the person was. The essence of what they responded was, when I talked, they listened to me and took my words into account. They didn't have to agree with me, but they had heard me. And that has been my mantra ever since. Have I heard what that person has said?
The other thing I'd add to that is that famous thing that I know you worked on is yes and.
Mm-hmm.
Because we very often people ask a question because they want to get their own point of view across.
I've done it many times.
Yeah, and the danger, I think, is when you get to yes but and not yes and.
Yeah.
Because yes but is closing, whereas yes and is building and hearing. Yeah. And there are ways of respecting what somebody said. One of the most frustrating things can be, and going back to working internationally, can be that you're the person on the other side of the desk or around the table may be spending time. Their nature may be to take time to consider what they've said they're going to say, and we like to fill the vacuum.
Yes, yes.
And I think that's the danger. You need to let the silence hang. And we talked that the idea of listening ears, I think, comes on to I've written about the idea of friendly fire. And knowing that within the organization you need a steering group of some sort, or people that are getting together that you can go to, not just your sponsor, but other people in the organization that you can go to who have agreed in some shape or form to be like your mentors or your buddies as you work through that assignment.
Yes.
If you don't have that, you're really exposed.
Yes, you are. And it's interesting what happens when in the middle of an assignment, your sponsor, so to speak, has to leave.
Yes.
I got caught in that one time, and it was extremely hard to work through the rest of the assignment.
Well, it goes back because that goes back to this idea, I think, of many faceted. I talk about multiple stakeholders, but I think I've always said you need to be at least 3 levels. And one of the things I always talk about when it's sort of respect, going back to your respect comment, I would always try and see as a courtesy, even if it was paying a courtesy visit, certainly in Asia, certainly in the Middle East and Africa, I would pay a courtesy visit on the senior person in the organization. Just I want to say I'm here. I want to thank you for the opportunity, because at some point in time, they're going to look at what you're doing. And it's that mark of respect, which I think is massively important. Because you're going into their organization.
That's right.
And it means more in many parts of the world than it does in our more avaricious part of the world.
Oh, I think that's so true. So true. There is a higher value placed on relationship.
Well, I want, as an example, slightly tangential, but just as an example, I'm having lunch with somebody I mentored as a trainee 45 years ago, a Saudi trainee who is now head of the international division of the largest oil company in the world.
Wow.
And we can still have that conversation.
Yeah.
And it's really important, because the way you behave, the way you leave people is really critical. It doesn't matter what's happened. You need to give people face, and you need to give them respect. And I just think about, just looking at the time, I think of a few things around. I talked about multiple stakeholders. The other thing that I've often thought of is how do you handle these left field moments that you're completely unaware of and just come back and hit you. You almost and it's harder in a virtual world. I've not worked this out yet. We haven't perfected virtual peripheral vision. and I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was in Tehran some years ago, working with the largest company there with a friend of mine, and we were in a very interesting assignment around a knowledge strategy. and we had a big audience, and the technician was coming to wire me up. We were on a stage, and we were going to be running a day of workshops to try and get out of them exactly some of the points you were talking about how do you, what does it feel like working in this organization? What is the culture? What is it when they understand respect? All those sort of good things. And he wired me up, and he took my coffee cup away and everything else. And then he brought it back, and he gave it to me, and I had nowhere to put it. And I very nearly put my coffee cup on a copy of the Quran. and it was that sort of moment that you realize that you can't relax. It's more tiring.
Yes.
But you can very easily cause a faux pas without really thinking about it. And you have to be flexible. I was in Sudan, and I was working, funny enough, with the World Bank and the University of Khartoum, and we were doing a week around how could knowledge improve the way that the society was working and businesses were working. And I had an invitation. They'd have organized an itinerary for me, but as often happens, you weren't given much of a briefing of what you were expected to do. So all of a sudden I was invited to, the chauffeur came along and said, on the way, he said, this was the National Oil Company. And he said, they're looking forward to your talk. And I said, what talk? He said, the talk on knowledge management in the oil and petrochemical industry. And I went there, and there were 200 people sitting in an auditorium on me. and it was one of those, okay, how do you not offend people? I haven't got a presentation. What am I going to say?
So what did you do?
I said, can I have 5 minutes, please? So I went away and I started scribbling things down about, okay, what does knowledge mean? And I started by asking them to put a hand up about what kept them awake at nights. And we then had a 45-minute conversation about how, by sharing knowledge, how learning from the fact that they found oil in that part of the business, they could build on what the Malaysians have done. But it was exhausting. So I guess in terms of people watching this, I think you have to be willing to be incredibly flexible and never know where you're going to find yourself next.
That's right. That's right.
And you'll find that you emerge as a far more confident person the other side.
Well, I say that all the time, Paul. It's this difficulties that really build our resilience and our confidence in ourselves that make it possible. Yeah. You really don't want to have everything being perfectly easy, because you don't become a very interesting person then.
There's just sort of wrapping up the idea of some of the things, we've talked about what do you do when you win business? How do you go through? How do you report back? One of the things that I found worked particularly well, and it worked in the UK, actually winning business as well as working in different parts of the world, and that was to give people a bit of a view of what they might be getting.
Mm-hmm.
This thing about visuals, I think, is really important, and it goes back to working and communicating as well. It's that idea of having some kind of common understanding and image, and that really makes a difference. So working with Victoria as we did, we never quite knew what things would shape like in the end, but there was an element of trust with the client. But what we found very often was, if we could show them some of the things that they'd be getting, what the final report might be looking like,
mm-hmm.
It was much easier for people who think in a very linear way for them to say, here's milestones, this is what we're signing off. And the getting paid thing for me has always been about milestones and value frames.
Mm.
Am I giving value for what's happened?
Yeah.
And getting people to talk about that value. You talked about future story. Let me give you one example of that. The idea of saying, this worked very well in the Caribbean or Caribbean, depending on where you come from. It was a particularly interesting piece of work, but we found what landed well was the idea of saying, imagine a world in which,
mm-hmm.
and doing future story where we ask people to think about what might happen if it was working well.
Mhm.
And in a political environment, which was Sudan, working with the health people at the time, because the way the regime was, you couldn't talk about things, what they didn't have. We asked them, and I've written about this, we asked them to think about what the role of a doctor might be like in 5 years' time. So a day in the life of Dr. Anwar, and we had the picture up of Dr. Anwar, and people told stories about it. And then we backfilled and said, what do you need in order to achieve that?
Yeah, it's a very powerful way to do strategic planning. You know, we've really almost filled our hour, Paul, but I want to make sure that I give you a moment to think about that young person. You said you counseled this young person 45 years ago. Let's say you're a young person today starting out in your career and you say, you know, I really want to have international experience somewhere along the line. How would you advise them to prepare themselves for taking on that task?
I used to before you highlighted this earlier on, and it's something I always do. I will always learn enough to say good morning, good evening, or whatever to my audience in the language that I am. But that goes further. Read the news.
Yes.
Before you go, talk to the taxi driver.
Yeah.
Go and see the PAs of the people that you're going to meet. You know, find out about things, show passion, show interest. If you want to work in someone's country, try and understand what makes them tick. Find out about the food. I used to always travel on local transport. People could never understand it. In Iran, they were terrified. I used to disappear off and walk from one office to the other. And even in Saudi Arabia, I used to get the train from Dammam to Riyadh rather than plane. But it's getting and I use a jeepney in the Philippines. It's getting under the skin. Take trains. Don't just fly in and out and live in a gilded bubble. You know, find out what people eat. Understand. Food's a great lubricant. It's a great conversation. But I think the biggest thing is show passion for the country you're working in. Get to understand. Don't be political, but get to understand how these things work, and do make, again, that's that respect thing that is massively important. You know, don't go in and be loud and be obnoxious. Be deferential. Respect other people's cultures.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I come from a nation which goes where the majority of people, and I'm not knocking the British, but the majority of people go on holiday. They go to the airport. They go into an all-inclusive hotel, and then they come back from the airport. They've traveled but not experienced.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, COVID has killed everybody's travel plans, but for me, the greatest experience I've had in all the work I've ever done is making genuine friendships in so many countries, mm-hmm. and breaking bread with people, you know, from prime ministers in other countries to our, you know, in Havana, we went, my wife and I were going out with a guide, and we wanted to take her into the restaurant with us because she was Cuban. They wouldn't, although she was a lawyer. So we said, where do you and the driver go? So we went with them.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, go on.
I was going to say, you're absolutely right about eating local. When I was in Shenzhen, China, there was a family who invited me into their home. And I think whenever I think of China now, it's always in context of the experience of that single meal in Shenzhen. Very different.
There's another thing that I would just say, and this isn't de rigueur in lots of places now, but I've said it, I think you're going to give it out. There's three things: look smart, act smart, and be smart.
Yeah, always.
Okay? Always. And most people don't do that. When they travel, they turn up looking like they've just got out of bed. Now, it's important for it. You get treated how you look, whether you like it or not. You know, so I think that's massive. Yeah, and I did talk about the country, didn't I? and just see if there's anything else in the notes.
Well, actually, we have run out of time because I have a few more things. But we knew this would happen. We knew this would happen. We'll just have to have you back. That's all. I cannot thank you enough. This has been, for me, delightful. I had forgotten that you had come to some of our early conferences here in Washington, and that was more than 20 years ago. So it's amazing to me. And I love the fact that you've given me a new phrase. I heard you say, and what I understood you to mean. That's just a wonderful, wonderful little tool there. So again, Paul, thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, good, good, good. The more that you read, the more things you will know, the more that you learn, the more places you'll go. That's something from a book called I Can Read with My Eyes Shut by Dr. Seuss. And speaking of reading, let me remind you that we have for you a document that you can order. And let me get the source. Let's see if I get the right one. There it is. There it is. This is where you should go. MadelynBlair.com/media. Scroll down to where it asks you if you want it, and you fill it in, and you'll get a great little summary of some of the things that Paul has talked about. It's to give you a reference. Connecting and learning with new places is, to me, almost unexpected. Yet today, all the places that we can go to, all the spots in the world, they're becoming more known and more knowable. A career without some touch with another culture is limiting. Businesses have recognized this and branched out across the globe. If this is part of your career, think about it now. And Paul has given you all kinds of ideas, especially that one about find out about what's happening in the countries. I personally read the New York Times. That's just the newspaper I like, because I want to see what's happening across the world every morning, because that gives me that global perspective, no matter where I work. But my question to you is, are you thinking about an international assignment and what you should do? I suspect that what you have heard from Paul has inspired you to think about it at the very least. And don't forget to go and get that document. And if you have a topic that you would like to hear more about here on Unlocked, write to me at Madelyn@MadelynBlair.com. I love hearing from you. And if I use your topic, you will receive a copy of my book, Essays in Two Voices, being used by couples and by companies across 4 continents. Next week, we'll be talking with Bruce Waltuck. Bruce is a leading member of the Plexus Institute and professor at Keene University. He works in social entrepreneurship and is expert in something called liberating structures. Nothing to do with politics. It's liberating in terms of opening possibilities in creative ways. Be sure to put it on your calendar and join us on April 27 at noon Eastern here on E360 and live stream on my YouTube channel. Thanks for listening to this segment of Unlocked. Be sure to comment on social media about the show and what you gained from it. And if you want to return to today's conversation, you can always go to the archives at MadelynBlair.com/media. Thank you for watching Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience. Paul, again, thank you. And let me now say goodbye to everybody. Thank you.